right, let's take a look at Chapter 1, An Introduction to Life on Earth. Let's start simply. Let's define biology. So its prefix bios means life, and its suffix ology means study of. So together, biology means the study of life. But what is life? Well, we actually have these characteristics or properties of life, like homeostasis, or the ability to actively maintain organized complexity and internal environment, the ability to acquire and use materials and energy, being able to sense and respond to stimuli, grow, develop, reproduce, evolve. All these are properties of life that we say, and we will talk about, organisms sharing and having in common. Let's start really basic. We're going to talk about how organisms actively maintain organized complexity. The basic unit of life is the cell, of which there are two types, eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. Cells are able to maintain kind of an internal environment inside a plasma membrane, which separates them from their surroundings. The two groups again are eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. And eukaryotic cells have a variety of organelles, these structures that carry out different functions for the cell. But they also have a nucleus. That's kind of the key between eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells have a nucleus that contains their genetic material called DNA, whereas prokaryotic cells lack organelles, and they definitely do not have a nucleus. Here's a cell on the right that has a nucleus, so it would be considered eukaryotic. All organisms that are prokaryotic are unicellular, or are just one cell, whereas eukaryotic cells may be a part of a unicellular or a multicellular organism. But if it's multicellular, what we mean is at least two cells or more. Here's an example of a multicellular organism. We know that because it has kind of rudimentary digestive systems and sensory stimuli. We can see an eye. It's able to respond to stimuli, get nutrients, and reproduce. And we can tell that just from this labeled image. This is an image of a water flea, or a Daphnia, which you can find in pond water. So this organism is, if we had to guess, most likely multicellular and made up of eukaryotic cells. Because we see that it has many structures within it, it's definitely more than a single cell, so likely not prokaryotic. What about organisms being able to acquire and use materials and energy? Well, a lot of energy is obtained from the sun, like plants using that sunlight to carry out photosynthesis and make sugar. Other organisms have to consume their nutrients in order to obtain energy, but organisms use this energy continuously to maintain stable internal body situations. Other important minerals to organisms to make sure that they take in minerals, water, chemical building blocks like the amino acids that make up protein, and simple sugars that make up carbohydrates. All these things can be garnered from their environment. A lot of this energy is also cycled. Plants and animals break down their nutrients, and decay is going to be recycled into the soil. A lot of energy is lost as heat back to the atmosphere and then comes right back down into plants, which herbivores like the zebra eat, and then carnivores and omnivores eat other organisms or organisms and plants. So there is a constant recycling of non-living nutrients back into living things. And since living things constantly or continuously use energy, they have to be careful about maintaining specific internal conditions, about taking these energy components and incorporating them into a way where their internal body environment is relatively stable. That process is called homeostasis. Some examples are keeping body temperature steady, blood sugar level steady, and usually what we mean by steady is within a normal range. There's usually a low to a high level of that dynamic range, even though a lot of times you see an average, which looks a little bit more like a set point. Some more on homeostasis includes endotherm and ectothermy. Birds and mammals, we are endotherms, which means that we're organisms that internally warm ourselves using metabolic processes. So these metabolic processes are a part of homeostasis. We have to manage kind of that influx or decrease of heat to make sure we maintain stable body temperature. Whereas reptiles, which are ectotherms, they have to maintain similar homeostatic mechanisms, but via behavior versus metabolic processes. because they have to kind of move about in their environment to help maintain their body temperature, such as a lizard basking on a warm rock to heat up, or burrowing into the ground in order to cool off. So, different homeostatic mechanisms here, one behavioral, one internal and more metabolic, but both types of homeostasis, ways that organisms maintain stable internal body temperature, blood sugar, or functioning, regardless what's going on around them. One of the major ways that homeostasis works is via a mechanism called negative feedback. What negative feedback is you get an initial stimulus, and the response is to undo that. So the response is negative, or the opposite of the original stimulus. For example, if we have an increase in body temperature, we sweat to cool the body down. The initial stimulus was an increase in temperature. The response was a decrease in temperature. What about the opposite? What if you get cold and your body temperature decreases? Well, you might start shivering, which produces heat to warm you up. So the initial stimulus was a decrease, and the response was an increase. It's the opposite of the original stimulus. That's negative feedback. All right, moving on. How do organisms sense and respond to stimuli? Plants, fungi, unicellular organisms, they can all respond to stimuli. Animals are probably what we're most used to thinking of responding to stimuli, like feelings of hunger or stimuli such as light, temperature, sound, gravity, touch, chemicals. But all organisms that we consider living, so organisms, respond to stimuli. Here's a plant responding to light. It's showing us positive phototropism. Phototropism is when a plant moves towards or away from light. Positive phototropism is when the plant moves towards light. Negative phototropism is when the plant moves away. And there's different types of stimuli that plants, animals, fungi, all the organisms that we're going to be talking about can use to respond. What about organisms growing? That actually requires a little bit of stimulus and kind of chemical signaling within the cell or the organism. Something like a prokaryotic bacteria grows by enlarging their cells. Then they divide to reproduce. Those divided cells are usually smaller than the original cell, but they'll get bigger, they'll grow. Animals and plants grow by increasing the numbers of cells that make up tissues, and those tissues make up organs, and those make up organ systems, which organ systems make up an organism. Some of this growth might come with development, where a growing organism becomes more complex. So we might start with just initially cells, and then cells coming together to make tissues, tissues coming together to make organs and organ systems in the organism. So you can see how growth and development can definitely go together. Organisms also reproduce. Some organisms just copy themselves. That's a type of asexual reproduction. Here we see Streptococcus bacterium dividing to produce two new bacterium where we had one. And those are going to be clones of each other. Plants oftentimes produce spores or seeds, and those then can germinate and grow more plants. And sexual reproduction, seen in both plants and animals, is a more complex process where we introduce genetic variability or some changes possibly in the genetics to help with adaptation. So all life forms reproduce. Whether it's asexual or sexual reproduction, we get copying or genetically variant offspring. With asexual reproduction, again, this is a process by which a single organism produces genetically identical offspring. The key here is asexual reproduction produces clones or identical offspring. So all the offspring in asexual reproduction have all of their DNA from one parent. Sexual reproduction is a combination of genetic material from two parents. So it should produce genetically different offspring based on the two parents' genetics that are coming together during fertilization and fusion to form a zygote. And when we talk about reproduction, it very much leans into the idea of inheritance. We can talk about genetics. We can look at mutations. And we can even focus a little bit more on DNA. Because reproduction always involves the concept of inheritance. Inheritance is the process by which physical and biological characteristics are transmitted from the parent or parents to the offspring. So it's the process wherein genetic material is passed on to offspring, and we see the physical ramifications of that inheritance. Mutations can occur during this genetic processing from parents to offspring, this creation of the next generation. And not all mutations are beneficial. Some don't do anything, but some can be adaptations or can lead to a quality that allows those organisms to both survive and reproduce and pass on that mutation to the next generation. Mutations are considered changes in an organism's DNA. They're abrupt and marked changes in the DNA of an organism, and it has to be different to that of its parents, or it's not a mutation. What is DNA again? It's deoxyribonucleic acid, and it's the set of instructions that are contained in chromosomes. They arrange themselves in certain ways within the nucleus of eukaryotic cells, but they're a set of instructions. They're a set of genetic material that gives instructions for how to make proteins and other components of a living system. Let's take a look at DNA. So here's deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA kind of spelled out. So deoxyribose is the sugar you find in DNA. So that's where that name is coming from. What DNA is made up of is many different repeating segments of nucleotides. If you look at a bunch of those nucleotides together, we're looking at a segment of the whole molecule of DNA called a gene. So a gene is a specific segment of DNA made up of nucleotides. What's in the nucleotides? Well, in DNA, you have a double helix. That double helix is two strands, those strands on the outside, represented by blue and yellow. Those are the phosphate and sugar backbones. So you have a phosphate group and a sugar, and then you have that internal ladder structure, a base. So a phosphate, a sugar, and a base is what makes up a nucleotide. When you put these nucleotides together in this arrangement, you get DNA. That arrangement being the sugar phosphate backbone on the outside and the bases in the middle, kind of like the rungs of a ladder. You can even see those dots. Those are the hydrogen bonds that hold our nucleotide bases together. And the sequence of letters in a gene or a segment of DNA actually provides the blueprint for making proteins, which are very functional within cells. All right, we're going to move on and talk about another characteristic of life, which is the fact that organisms evolve. This descent with modification or kind of change over time from generation to generation is called evolution. And how an organism fits within its environment and adapts thanks to mutations as a consequence of evolution is dictated by natural selection. Here are some examples of adaptations. They're very diverse and unique, like the tongue length of nectar-feeding moths, and they happen to match the size of the flower from which it feeds. And that probably happened because adaptations occurred in the genetic code that produced some offspring that had a certain length of a tongue, and it happened to fit the flower they feed on really well. Because that fit was great between the organism and where it acquires energy, those organisms were able to survive, maybe more than the others, of that same generation, and they survived long enough to reproduce. So they passed down that trait of a tongue that's just the right length to their offspring. And over time, because that's an adaptation that was beneficial, we saw that those were the survivors of that generation that continued to pass down that trait. Another example is heat-resistant archaea that live in boiling hot springs. They would pass down particular resistant genes that allowed them to live in these extreme environments. A lot of the bacteria in archaea that live in these extreme environments are called extremophiles. So what you're seeing here is that adaptations enhance the reproductive potential of the individual exhibiting them. But if that adaptation is not inheritable, it means nothing. Adaptations are not constant. If those organisms don't reproduce, they don't pass down their genetics. But what we see in nature, in environments, is that the next generation looks like the survivors. And the survivors that live and reproduce to produce the next generation oftentimes have an adaptation that's beneficial and gets passed down to those new offspring. Now, when we talk about the scientific theory of evolution, we oftentimes bring in those naturalists that formulated it, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. You've maybe only heard of Darwin, but both Darwin and Wallace in the mid-1800s created and put together manuscripts that were supported by vast amounts of evidence towards the scientific theory of evolution, not a theory at the time. Darwin did kind of get the jump on Wallace and published his On the Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection paper in 1859. And he published this paper and supported it with his naturalist writings and observations because he had been throughout a kind of long journey. That's what a naturalist does. They go on these journeys, they take observations, they write down information, they observe. And he provided all that observation in his On the Origin of the Species. Now, we've since developed this theory further, but that was kind of the first instance of this being put in paper in a kind of scientific writing. And now we know, thanks to molecular data, that there's a lot of similarities found among different types of organisms as a result of common ancestry. It's no longer us just kind of looking at two organisms and being, oh yeah, those look similar. No, instead we use a lot of molecular data. Evolutionary history, such as fossils, also provide a lot of that information. One example is, thanks to molecular data, we know that humans and chimpanzees share between 96 and 99% of their DNA sequence. Even strawberries and bananas share about 60% of their DNA sequence. So it's less the difference between DNA and more the molecular expression within organisms that account for many of the differences we see in the animal kingdom. Now, let's talk more about natural selection before we move on. Natural selection causes evolution. So you could say natural selection is the mechanism of evolution. And what happens is nature doesn't have a goal. But because nature favors those organisms that can survive and reproduce, if there's something that an organism has that allows it to survive and reproduce more successfully than others that maybe lack the traits or adaptations it has, then it's those organisms that pass down their genes to the next generation. They're kind of the winners of their particular generation, and it's the survivors that pass down their genes. Let's look at an example. All right, here we have a population. It's a population of beetles. They have different colors to their exoskeleton. Some are very bright, some are a little muted, some blend into the background very well. Well, the ones that are bright, they're easy to pick off. So a predator like a bird would easily find these bright colored beetles. And over time, all that's really going to be left is darker colored beetles. Why? Well, the darker colored beetles survived. And so they're the ones that survive long enough to reproduce and pass down their genetic material. That genetic material shows up in the next generation, and it's going to encode for a darker exoskeleton. Because all the organisms that had a lighter exoskeleton, all the light beetles, they were preyed upon. They didn't survive long enough to reproduce, so they don't influence what the next generation looks like. And the reason that we start with a population with varied inherited traits at the beginning is because that's what populations look like. Populations of organisms are not homologous. They're not all the same. We often have slight variation due to mutations that have occurred over time, slight changes in genes. And some of those mutations are not beneficial, like that light color of the exoskeleton was not beneficial to the beetles because they can be preyed upon easily by birds. Some mutations are beneficial, some are not, some absolutely do not change the physical traits of an organism at all. But it's these mutations that can lead to adaptations, that can lead to environmental pressures that provide natural selection. What's some other examples of adaptations? White colored fur in a very snowy environment, that's a great camouflage. What about just the fact that the fur is going to be insulating? It oftentimes is underlaid by adipose tissue or fat. Those are examples of adaptations, which are structures or physiological processes or behaviors that aid in survival and reproduction. And if those adaptations do not aid in survival, do not aid in reproduction, if an organism can't adapt fast enough, especially to changing environmental conditions, oftentimes that leads to extinction or complete elimination of a species. Oftentimes an adaptation that is beneficial at one point in time can become no longer beneficial if the environment has changed. That's what is meant by natural selection or environmental pressures. Nature is only selecting because that's what puts pressure on survival and reproduction for organisms. Now, humans have kind of taken evolution evolutionary theory, and we've used it in medicine, conservation, and agriculture. But when humans are involved, it's considered a little bit more artificial selection. So, artificial selection is natural selection that has human intervention. And when you have human intervention, it works a lot faster. Natural selection can take thousands, millions, billions of years, whereas artificial selection can take just a couple of years, maybe a decade or two, at most thousands of years. But artificial selection has been utilized for our crops, livestock, pets, in order for them to bear kind of no longer any resemblance to their ancestral species, such as vegetables like cabbage and kale and broccoli and cauliflower. They all come from the same ancestor, but due to artificial selection and selecting for terminal buds or stems and flowers that look a certain way, or plants that happen to have a cluster of flowers instead of single flowers, we've created all these different vegetables in a very short amount of time. So, before we continue and talk about how do scientists study life, make sure you go back and look at all the properties of life. You want to have that as a very staunch kind of background and foundation before you go further.